So what brings you to our neck of the woods?
Traveling around the state. We're back this week, some time away from Washington, D.C. So when I'm not in Washington, I'm traveling the state. And so it's good to be on the west side. So I was Saginaw Bay City yesterday. Well, Detroit yesterday. Saginaw Bay City before that, Traverse City. So now we're here in Holland, we'll be in Muskegon, and then I'll be back to Grand Rapids Sunday, Monday.
So you're making the rounds.
Making the rounds.
Yep.
As I said before, I take the job of being a representative seriously, so you have to actually be out in the community and traveling. And it's a really big state.
Yes,
so
it is.
And I still have to do the job in Washington, so I'm not although I come home every weekend, my wife is here, my daughter's still in high school, so I'm back every weekend. But when I'm back on the weekend, I'm usually out about somewhere as well.
Pretty sure it takes longer to drive from Detroit to Houghton than it does to Detroit to D.C.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I remind my colleagues that how big the state is, because that's exactly right. It's a longer drive than to D.C. The flight to Marquette is about the same as the flight to Washington, an hour in the air. So it's a lot of ground, but it's beautiful, especially this time of year. It's nice to have a lot of color on the way here, which is nice.
So you've been pretty busy as of late. One bill in particular, now law, I should say. You're working on with our own local Representative
Right.
Heisinger. Can you tell us a little bit more about the remanufacturing law?
Right. Yeah, I was happy to work with Congressman Heisinger in a bipartisan way. I introduced the bills. I'm actually the first bill that I introduced in the Senate with Senator Langford, who's a Republican out of Oklahoma. But it kind of looked at a practical, common sense way to repair vehicles in a cheaper fashion, and was also good for Michigan. So basically, we spend roughly $1 billion a year maintaining the federal fleet of automobiles and trucks around the country. And so the bill that we introduced, which is now law, says that as the government is contracting out for repairs and taking bids, that remanufactured parts should be part of that. In the fact that, one, it saves a lot of money. Remanufactured parts are much cheaper. They also use considerably less energy, about 85% less energy. It's easier to remanufacture than start from scratch. So it'll save taxpayers money, it'll save energy, and it just so happens that we also happen to do a fair amount of that here in Michigan. We have a lot of remanufactured facilities in the state that hire and employ many people that receive good wages, and we want to continue to strengthen that industry as well.
Do you have any figures on how much money it's going to save?
It's hard to put because it will depend on what they actually do. But I mean, if you look at, I've seen numbers like, was it an alternator? I think that's the example we give. Say it's a new one is $1,300, a remanufactured one is like half that price. So it can be pretty substantial depending on how much they actually use it. Fuel pumps. I was at a facility in Grand Rapids that does fuel pumps, and those are also close to half of what a new part is. But it's also important to note that they're fully warranted, so it's not like you're taking something that isn't going to be back. They're fully warranted, just like you're buying a new part, except they're reconditioned. They look brand new. They come back to you.
So potentially $500 million a year.
Well, that's total repair costs, so it's not just parts, it's
labor,
everything
okay.
else. So, but it'll be a substantial amount of money. It'll be a substantial, and to me, it's just which is why we're able to build broad bipartisan coalition to it. It's common sense, save some money, and of course, Bill and I understand the importance for jobs here in Michigan as well.
Talk about working with Bill in a bipartisan way in a bill. It's kind of a rare feat in Washington these days. What do you think it'll take to get more work done in that fashion?
Well, that's the way I work. I think that's the only way that you can work, is to try to pull together that coalition. So actually, I've had another bill that was incorporated into the human trafficking legislation that passed earlier. The second bill, I had another bill passed and signed into law, and I worked with Senator Cassidy, a Republican out of Louisiana, as well. So I strive the bills that I put out work. I always try to get Republican co-sponsors with me if possible to do that, to work that way. That is what the American people are looking for, is just common sense, practical solutions, bringing people together. And I've been able to build those relationships and want to continue to do that. And just like this bill, here's the bill. It's a smaller bill compared to the big issues that we're confronting in the Senate. but it gives you an opportunity to work with someone, to build a relationship with them, and then when you have those relationships, then you can find more common ground later. So there are certainly differences between the parties right now, we know that, but there's also a lot that we have in common. So it's important to focus on what we have in common as well, and then use that experience, use those relationships then to try to bridge some of the tougher issues that we have to face. So, and I've had an opportunity in the short time I've been in the Senate to build those relationships with some senior members, but also new ones. There are 13 new U.S. senators that came in, 12 Republicans and me. I've been able to develop a good relationship with 12 Republicans, because when you come in new, there's a certain bond you have coming in as the new folks, kind of like
You're like the freshman
class, yeah. And I joke I'm the president of the Democratic freshman class right now, but it is, you have that, you come in, we have briefings together, we have orientation together, our spouses have gotten to know each other, and some social events as well as a class, freshman class, both Republicans and the Democrat. As a result of that, Senator, the two bills I had are both two freshman Republicans that I've worked with to get those passed.
Do you see more of those efforts going on in the body at large in terms of bipartisanship? I mean, is there hope of additional measures being passed that maybe might be on bigger issues, say immigration?
Well, it's more difficult in the House. So, immigration, we did pass, before I was in the Senate, though, they passed comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate in a bipartisan way. We passed another big issue at the end of July in the Senate. We passed bipartisan surface transportation bill for roads. 6-year authorization, which is a big deal. We needed to have more than these short-term fixes. And that was bipartisan, broad bipartisan support came together. Unfortunately, the House isn't willing to take it up. So the House is a lot more difficult to do that. I have found in the brief time that I've been in the Senate now is that it is a little easier to build those relationships in the Senate, and it's primarily because it's a smaller body. You have 100 folks, and you can get to know people better, more personally. There's also the institutional mechanism of the Senate, which helps, is that in order to overcome a filibuster, you need 60 votes. And there are 54 Republicans, so they need 6 Democrats in order to move anything forward. And so that means you have to talk to folks. And when the Democrats were in charge, they needed to have Republicans. So it does kind of force folks to work together as well. But it is a different feel in the Senate than in the House, and the collegiality I found is different. So, in addition to the bills that I just passed, the other bill that I'm working on is a National Criminal Justice Commission that we need to do a top-to-bottom review of the criminal justice system. We haven't done that for over 50 years. The last commission we put together was back when Lyndon Johnson was the president of the country. So it's time, especially given what we've seen in Ferguson and Baltimore and other places. I have 22 co-sponsors on that legislation now. 10 of them are Republicans. My principal co-sponsor with me is John Cornyn, who is the second-ranking Republican in the Senate. I also have Lindsey Graham. I have Marco Rubio. A list of 10 Republicans. And you wouldn't normally see in the House a freshman minority party member getting the second-ranking majority leader on your bill. That doesn't really happen in the House, but it happens in the Senate. So, which is refreshing.
What kind of changes are you looking at in terms of the criminal justice system?
Well, this will be a commission come together to do that broad review. So it'll look at sentencing, it'll look at prison reform, it'll look at the grand jury system, it'll look at how we deal with returning folks as well. It's meant to be comprehensive, similar to what we did back 50 years ago. When right after Ferguson, the president formed a commission to look at the criminal justice system, but it was primarily focused on police tactics. And what that commission, their number one recommendation that they came out was that we need to have a broader commission. You've got to look at everything. You can't just focus on tactics. You've got to look at the whole system and how it all fits together and works. And so that's what it's meant to do. In addition to the broad bipartisan support, it's been endorsed by nearly all major police organizations have endorsed my bill, as well as the NAACP and Action Network, so it's civil rights groups, police groups coming together saying we need to have everybody at the table and have the discussion of what are some of the reforms that are necessary on a very broad basis. So we don't want to I don't want to point them in any particular direction. It's the putting the experts together that represent that broad coalition to come together to do that. And it's meant to fill in some of the other things that we're doing in the Senate now, and I think has a very good prospect of passing. In fact, looks like there's a bipartisan agreement on sentencing reform, which hopefully we'll see in the next month or so pass out of the Senate, which is looking to sentencing match, especially with overcrowding in federal prisons. How do we sentence appropriately, which means sentencing those folks who we're afraid of and are violent. Will continue to have tough sentences, but folks you're mad at, you may have not afraid of, you may have a different sentencing scheme in order to work that out. So we can pass some concrete, more focused legislation, and then the commission will look at everything else too, how you put it together, come back with a set of recommendations that then could act, and I think it'll have the political support. If it's a bipartisan commission with strong support from groups from civil rights to police, coming together with recommendations that should build the political momentum necessary to get bills passed. And that's what happened 50 years ago, a variety of recommendations. One that the general public will immediately recognize is when you call 911, that actually came out of the commission 50 years ago, saying we need to have a better system of communicating quickly emergency services. And it's those kinds of things that can come out of it.
What else have you noticed as differences between your term in the House and the Senate? Just as far as the way the bodies, things are working and people are working together.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you can build relationships better. Is there? The other thing that I found different that I like is just the breadth of issues you can deal with as an individual senator. In the House, you tend to be siloed a little more based on the committee that you serve on, and that's by nature because it's a very large body, and so you focus on that. I was on financial services, for example, in the House. In the Senate, you're on more committees because there's the same amount of topics you got to cover. You just have 100 people instead of 435 doing it, so you're on more committees. But the great thing is that you can do whatever. You can be involved in any issue that you really think is important for your state or things that you're important for the country. So, for example, this criminal justice commission that I've authored and have broad support for. I'm not on the Judiciary Committee. That's before the Judiciary Committee, but it's not my committee. In the House, people would say, "Well, you're doing a bill that's on your committee. That's going to be kind of hard." In the Senate, it's like, "Well, that's fine. You know, you can do if you have the support, go for it, make it happen." So that's refreshing to be able to do that.
I presume you watched the debates last night.
I did.
What were your takeaways?
Well, I support Hillary Clinton. I've endorsed her, and I thought she was very strong last night. I think she really had a command of the issues. She had a presence on stage, and did very well.
You supported the Iran deal, didn't you? And what do you make of all the opposition, against the Iran deal? And it seems like once you get into the meat of it, it seems not like a no-brainer. I mean, what do you make of all the opposition?
No-brainer on the plus side or the negative side?
It's a no-brainer to me on the plus side. I mean, like it's better than doing nothing in my mind. But
yeah.
What do you make of all the opposition towards it?
Well, and I think and I was actually I spent a lot of time researching it and thinking it through because I don't think it's quite that clear. Although in the end I voted for it because I think in the short run it is that clear in the short run. It's not so clear on the long run now. Is my concern. So I had some reservations. I put out a statement. I would be happy to forward that to you, which would go more in depth of the statement. But on the side that I'm concerned first, and then I'll answer why I supported it in the end. But my concern is really in the long term, is that the danger for Iran and the danger for nuclear proliferation generally is the ability to enrich uranium. Enriched uranium leads to the weaponization of material. And Iran will continue to be able to enrich uranium, and after year 10 they can enrich at greater levels, and in year 15 they can enrich at a commercial scale once again like they can right now. And so I think we have to make sure that we don't let this agreement just go as it is. We've got to be focused on in year 15 that we will not tolerate, we will not let the Iranians enrich at a commercial stage. Some of the arguments for the agreement was that, well, you can't stop them from enriching because countries are allowed to have a peaceful nuclear program under the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed for nuclear. However, you can still have a peaceful program and not have commercial style enrichment. In fact, most countries don't. There are 30 countries in the world that have peaceful nuclear programs, but only, I think it was 7 or 8 that actually enrich uranium. And those are the countries that tend to have weapons programs or that enrich. In fact, the United States, recently we signed a deal with the United Arab Emirates, and they wanted to develop peaceful nuclear power, and we said we will help you develop nuclear peaceful power, but you cannot enrich. We'll send you the enriched uranium, low-grade enriched uranium, we'll send it to you, and when you're done with it, we pick it up and we take it back. You don't have any capacity within your country to actually enrich uranium. And my concern with some of that is that in that agreement it said, you will not be held to a more strict agreement than exists in the Middle East. So you can argue now that we've allowed Iran to enrich uranium, so why would we not allow UAE to enrich uranium? Now they may not do that, they're allies of the U.S. and may not be wanting to do that now, but nevertheless I think it sets a very bad precedent, and that's why I think, and I'm going to be working on these issues in the years ahead, is that the international community has to come together and say we cannot allow countries to enrich uranium. We've got to find some way that we're enriching uranium perhaps as a world organization, and then countries can access that bank of enriched uranium for energy, but it always has to be returned so that we minimize the amount of enriched uranium out there that can be used for nefarious purposes. You know, the Canadians, for example, the Canadians don't enrich uranium. They have a nuclear program, but they don't enrich uranium. They actually decided not to enrich for a couple of reasons. One, the market isn't that strong, quite frankly. There's a fair amount of enriched uranium out there, and so they didn't think it was a good business decision. But two, they were afraid about the risk of proliferation. That's the Canadians. I'm not afraid of the Canadians, but they were afraid that if they enrich uranium, that just adds more enriched uranium out in the world that can then be further enriched into weapons grade, and they didn't want to be a part of it. So that's my main concern with the agreement, that we actually allow them but if they dot the I's and cross the T's, they can still have commercial enrichment in 15 years. So that's the long term. Serious concerns, but we have time to work on that. In the end, what it boiled down to is we still have time to work on that, but we have to be focused. In the short run, I don't think we had an option. That's the P5 plus one came together. You had the Europeans, you had the Russians, the Chinese that did a deal. They weren't going to go back and renegotiate if we walked away from that. We had a meeting with the ambassadors in the Senate, a number of senators and the ambassadors, and they said this is the best deal we can get. We feel good with this in the short run, but we can't go back to renegotiate it. And so I didn't want the United States to lose credibility to walk away after the other countries would all come together. And if you look at the specifics of it, is that Iran does have to ship out their enriched uranium and reduce it by 95% in the short run. They have to stop the plutonium production that was being done in a reactor and change the reactor so they can't do plutonium, which is the other path to a bomb. You've got enrichment, you've got plutonium, and it cuts that path off completely. And there's incredibly robust inspection that will occur in the years with the known sites and the ability to inspect other sites. So I'm fairly confident that the Iranians will abide by the agreement in the short run. But of course, if they don't, we have to be able to take action immediately. That if they break the deal, that then other options are on the table and sanctions have to come back. But I think in the short run they will abide by the agreement, partly because sanctions will be lifted. They'll have frozen assets that they have now will be unfrozen, and they aren't going to probably want to risk that at least in the short run. Although I don't trust the Iranians, I want to be very clear. I don't trust the Iranians at all. You cannot trust them. But I think that they will likely, I shouldn't say fairly confident, let me back that up. I think it will be likely that in the short run that they will not violate it. But we have to be very vigilant. We have to be on top of it and make sure that if there is any violation of it, that we immediately have the snapback provisions and the sanctions. And of course leave all options on the table, which includes the military option as well. And hopefully that's always the last. And I think the agreement, because I do think the military option is very important to keep that on the table. especially with a country that we cannot trust, which is very clear. We cannot trust the Iranians. That military option is on the table, but it also gives us more international credibility to use that military force after you've said we've entered into agreement with everybody together. Iranians, you agreed to these terms, and now you violated those terms. Once you violate those terms, then that allows us, if necessary, to use military option to prevent that. If the United States walks away from the agreement and says, no, I know we had an agreement, we're walking away, even though the rest of the world or countries part of the negotiations, then it looks as if we're the one walking away from an agreement, which puts us on a little more uncertain ground to then use military action when the rest of the world community can say, well, you had an agreement, you wouldn't even sign the agreement, now you're using military action. I'd rather be the Iranians or the bad guys. We're the good guys. And we're the ones that tried peace, always tried peace first. And I'm a former Navy guy, and I appreciate the power of the military as something that needs to be used, but it should only be used at last resort after you try to use peace first. And that's what the agreement does. So that's why I supported the agreement. Long answer to your question, but a very complicated issue.
Yeah.
Middle East, speaking of our military might and what we can and can't do in that area, it's not exactly the most stable. It's the opposite of stable, and now we've got Russia in Syria. I mean, what should we do about that? I mean, are we getting into a proxy war with Russia and Syria right now?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but I think that certainly Russia complicates it pretty dramatically with their involvement in Syria. But we want to step back, and I just got back from the Middle East about a month ago, and I went over there with a colleague of mine, and with my capacity on Homeland Security is one of the committees that I'm on. So we're there assessing what we were doing with ISIS and how the effort was going to combat ISIS. So I was in UAE, I was in Qatar, and I dealt with our military officials there as well as government officials from Qatar, but our military folks there at the base. I was in Baghdad, in Iraq, and then I went up to Jordan and visited the refugee camp Zatari, the largest refugee camp in Jordan. And there's no question we were dealing with a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions that we haven't seen in decades. Just in the camp that I was in, there were 85,000 people in the refugee camp. They're in the middle of the desert. They live in manufactured housing trailers, although to describe them as such I think is generous as to what they are. They get a food assistance. The food assistance that they can use to buy food in the camp is equal to about 50 cents a day is what they have to spend. Can't get a lot of food for 50 cents a day, and certainly not the variety that you need for a healthy diet.
Remember in college, you get 5 packs of ramen.
That's true, yeah. But after you've been there a while.
I'm pretty sure you get scurvy after a while.
Yeah, you need to have a little bit of fruit and other things too, which is helpful. So 50 cents a day. They get 1 bottle of propane a month to cook, and you got to be pretty. You have to stretch that out. But the thing that was most striking was just the level of despair. I had a chance to talk with a number of the folks who were in the camp, and they just feel hopeless. They don't have no hope for the future. When you go to a refugee camp, you think you're going to be there for a short period of time, and then you're there protected and safe, and then you go back. Folks I talked to had been over 3 years. Some of them, one close to 4 years, had been in the camp, which is a long time, and not knowing when you'll ever be able to leave. And their children not, their spotty education because the children need to be working in order to get some money to supplement their 50 cents a day that they get. It's a very tough situation. And when I asked, because of course there's been an exodus to Europe, and we're talking about the refugee issue, which you can talk about. But when he asked folks in the camp, I said, do you want to go to the United States? Where do you want to do? Do you want to go to the United States? Do you want to go to Europe? What would you like to do? And I said, no, we don't want to go to the United States. We don't want to go to Europe. We just want to go home. We just want to go home. That's what they want to do. That'd be what we want to do. Just want to go home to where you are. You don't want to have to go to some foreign place, a foreign country. Learn new language, new culture, all that. You just want to go home. And so we have to stabilize that, and that's not an easy thing. We have to get a political solution in Syria so folks can move back. But the fact that the Russians are there now just complicates that. And that happened after I came back. this complicates it immensely. And you have Russian forces who are claiming they're there to fight ISIS, but we're also know they're fighting folks who are also fighting Assad, and they're really there to prop up Assad, who has committed very heinous acts against his people. So, but to answer your question, as far as where we are kind of in the region, at least talking to our military commanders, they've felt and the evidence that they presented to us seemed compelling that the air campaign has been very effective in stopping ISIS from taking more territory. ISIS, it's very difficult for them to congregate because we can target that and break that up and strike those when folks are getting together, and so it makes, you can't have a military force if you can't bring some concentration of force together, and so that's been very effective. But you can't drive people out just with air power. You need to have forces on the ground to do that. And in Iraq, that would be the Iraqi army, not U.S. military. I don't support U.S. military combat personnel. We do have military personnel in Iraq, and I met with General Terry, who's the general in charge of the operation there, and we have advisors that are there, and of course there's the airstrikes. But it's the Iraqi military has to be able to regain that ground. We are all very disappointed when ISIS moved. The Iraqi army basically ran the other direction, and some of them defected even to the other side. But now our commanders are saying they've got mission-capable forces that can move into that area. They feel fairly confident that they'll be able to execute those missions, primarily to the new leadership with the officer corps that can execute the military operations. And you'll start seeing that in the months ahead. But it's going to take time. The problem in Syria is that we don't have ground forces there. It's Syrian, and there are some, at least there are ground forces there, but they're not ones that are like a government situation like we have in Iraq. There are forces that are opposition forces that are fighting. And unfortunately, our efforts to train and equip additional folks have been a failure to this point. Perhaps it can be salvaged going forward, but for my trip, I wasn't real encouraged with the training that was. The training was done, but then when folks were trained, very few of them actually came back and engaged in the fight. And there wasn't the scale that you need to really change the conflict. They had, this is a public, they had 15 fighters is what they said put out publicly. I think they came back in the first class. 15 people aren't going to make it, not going to be the scale. They're going to train more going forward, but you need thousands of people to do that. And so that's, I'm not sure that that's going to work. So there will need to be some sort of ground presence there, and hopefully with other Sunni countries that might come together to be involved. So I also think it's counterproductive for the United States to be engaged in that as well. It can't look like the United States is coming. There's got to be other Sunni countries, Sunni Muslim countries that are involved in pushing back ISIS and understanding that it's a threat to all people in the region.
Russia has complained that the U.S., if the U.S. wants Russia to fight ISIS, then why not share where some of those ISIS camps are, the location of those, and they can't bomb or attack these camps without knowledge of where they are, which the U.S. apparently possesses. So why has the U.S. not shared that? Is there a strategic reason for that, or what should we do about Russia specifically there?
Yeah, the sharing of intelligence is always a pretty tricky thing to do, and whenever you're dealing with your coalition partners, you have to have a great deal of trust with whoever you're sharing intelligence information with, because it's not only the information, but it's the means by which you collect it. You don't want the other side to know how you collect intelligence information as well, which is always usually that's the part of a classified briefing. It has less to do with what we actually know, but it's more about how did we actually get to know what we know. That's the part that's the top secret part, because you don't want folks to know how you can collect intelligence, because then they can do countermeasures to prevent you from collecting that intelligence. So you need to have a credible, trustworthy partner in that operation, and I would say we don't have that right now. That would be my guess with why we're not doing that.
Moving on from that, in one way, the U.S.'s involvement in the Middle East is a big reason why a lot of this is going on. Afghanistan, Iraq, to some smaller degree, Syria. we've said we'll accept, is it 10,000 refugees? I can't remember the exact number, but a small number of refugees. What should the U.S. be doing as far as accepting these refugees and allowing them into the borders, if anything? And what should they be doing to make sure they're not getting people such as ISIS members?
Right. Well, to that question, 2 points. One, I do think we can do more to bring in refugees from Syria and Iraq, and particularly some of the religious minorities, the Christians that have been persecuted in that area, to the United States. And two, though, you have to make sure you're doing all the security clearances that are necessary to make sure that you're bringing in legitimate refugees who are fleeing from persecution, as opposed to a fighter who's masquerading as such. So to flesh that out now, I sent a letter to President Obama saying, in response to his statement that we look to bring in 10,000 Syrian refugees. Now that's out of a pool. We bring in right now 85,000 refugees from around the world that are classified as refugees. So 85,000 people are allowed in. But the administration has said a minimum of 10 or up to 10,000 of that 85,000 should be from that region of the world. My view is that we can increase that to 30,000 in the next fiscal year. And that's not increasing the 85. You know, the 85 figure is still there around the world. It's just saying that what we should do is put a priority on that area where people are most vulnerable, and we see a humanitarian crisis of extreme proportions. That we should focus the refugees we're bringing in from around the world. We need a greater focus on Syria and Iraq, and particularly with the religious minorities in Iraq. The United Nations, the process for that is the United Nations will screen folks and determine whether or not they're legitimate refugees, and then they will recommend to certain countries that if you can take these folks, we would recommend that these would be people you could take that have gone through our screening process. We have pending for the United States from the United Nations 18,000 folks, and the number is increasing by about 1,000 a month. So in the next 12 months, we have 18,000 that have already been referred to the UN by the UN. And another 1,000 months, that's where I get the 30,000 number. Now, we still have to do our own screening. The UN has screened. We need to do our own screening, and Homeland Security has to do that. And I talked to Jay Johnson, the Homeland Security Secretary, about that, and we have the process in place. I think there are ways that we can streamline some of that to make it more efficient to do it, because we have to ramp some of that up, and we have to have even more screening when you have someone coming from an area like Syria than you would other parts of the world for a refugee. So we still have to have our system in place, but we already have that. We just got to make sure it's fully staffed to go. And then ultimately, I think we can get up to a number of 100,000. That's over, it's over a few years to do that.
I know we have to get going, and I'm going to schedule, but is there any...
Anything else that you've been working on that you want the people of West Michigan to know about in particular?
Well, the one issue that I'm really involved in right now. How much time do we have today?
It's like maybe 1 or 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. 1 or 2 minutes. Sorry about that. I can ask.
I know it's
the issue that I'm working on right now deals with oil pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac. So the Line 5, which has a lot of folks very concerned, and I'm very concerned as well. Certainly, folks here in West Michigan know what can happen with a pipeline break, with what we saw in Kalamazoo 5 years ago. The pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac is a 60-plus-year-old pipeline. You're all very familiar with that. That we're very concerned about. And so I've introduced legislation with Senator Stabenow for pipeline safety, and we can get you the details of all the aspects of it. But I'm focused on it in the fact that I serve in addition to Homeland Security, I'm on the Commerce Committee, and the Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over pipeline safety. PHMSA is the federal agency that oversees pipeline safety. They're up for their reauthorization this fall. In fact, we're going to reauthorize it hopefully in the next month or two. We'll be taking that up. And I'm hoping to incorporate a lot of the measures in my pipeline bill into the PHMSA. I've been working, speaking of bipartisan, I've been working with Senator Thune, who's the Republican chair of Commerce. He's been very open, he's been very supportive of the efforts. We're in daily conversations with his staff as well, and with other folks. And so right now I'm cautiously optimistic that many aspects of the bill that I've introduced will be put into the PHMSA reauthorization that we'll get it. And so that deals just roughly, it's going to have enhanced oversight of pipelines, especially in what are considered high consequence areas. And we define high consequence areas as basically the entire Great Lakes Basin, because an oil pipeline break anywhere here is potentially catastrophic. And also the fact that we really don't know how to clean up oil in fresh water. It's a lot more difficult than salt water, and the technology isn't there, the science isn't there. And so that should be a high consequence area, because it's not only Line 5 through the Straits that I'm concerned about, it's Line 5 for its whole length, but particularly in the UP, there's very open areas there and a lot of tributaries that then go into the Great Lakes. But the Straits was a particular focus. The University of Michigan did a study recently, and they said let me get you a copy of that, or the details on that. In the entire Great Lakes Basin, the absolute worst place for an oil spill is the Straits of Mackinac, in the entire basin. And it's primarily because the water flow through the straits, which is significant. And it can change direction. It can go from east to west, and it does daily. So if it's heading west, that's down the Lake Michigan shoreline here, and of course folks here would be very concerned about that. And it's also the volume. The volume that goes through the Straits of Mackinac is equal to 10 times that of Niagara Falls, what goes through there. That's a massive amount of water. So having an oil spill there is a problem. And the focus, an additional focus of my legislation, which I'm particularly concerned about, as difficult as it is to clean up a spill in freshwater in particular, because we don't have the microorganisms, and you can't use dispersants because you don't want to disperse oil throughout the Great Lakes. When 40 million people drink water from the Great Lakes, you can't do those kinds of things. As difficult as all that is, can you imagine how difficult it is when there's a lot of ice? And the Straits of Mackinac freeze with very thick ice. The Coast Guard can't easily get through with icebreakers, let alone trying to clean up oil that would be underneath that ice and spreading over with that massive water moving back and forth. So in my bill, we talk about, and this is surprising to me, but when you have a spill recovery plan, you have to talk about, can you do this when there's heavy ice cover? And then that, of course, leads to the question, if you can't, maybe you shouldn't operate a pipeline with crude going through there when you cannot clean up if there's an accident. In the worst case scenario. So this is something I'm very focused on right now, and will be in the next, especially the next month or so as we do FEMSA reauthorization. Happy to get more information specifically about it, because it's especially for us in Michigan and folks in Holland here. Everybody loves the Great Lakes. It's in our DNA. There isn't anything more. Next to our people, it's the most important resource we have as a state. We can't risk it.
Does that have any potential effects on gas prices?
Well, it's the crude that we have the concern about. So the question is, and part of that bill is also that while we are looking at the potential environmental impacts of it too, is that we have to look at alternatives. So as to what would be if that pipeline were to shut down, what would be the alternative? Now we have a web of pipelines all over the country, so how
every time one of them stops or a refinery stops, gas prices in Michigan go up $1.
But how would you redirect that? How would you make that change? And now there's natural gas, other things that go through the pipeline. It's an environmental risk as well, but it's not as significant as crude. We're still trying to get all the data, and that's part of this bill too, is to have more transparency so you can actually get this data as to where it flows. But it looks as if the vast majority of the oil that goes through the pipeline actually goes to Canada. It starts in Canada, and it goes through the Straits down to Sarnia Port Huron pipeline, and it's off into Montreal. So it looks like we're just the road from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. We're the highway. So it may not have much impact at all on any U.S. refineries or in Michigan.
Oh, I gotta get going. Thank you so much, guys.
One more question. You got a prediction for Saturday's game?
I'm a Michigan State fan, so